All right, and welcome to the Capitalist Party on this Thursday at 12:30. And first, I want to introduce everyone to my compatriots because we don't have comrades in the Capitalist Party because we're not socialists. We have compatriots and I don't know, colleagues, I suspect. So my colleague Gideon Hubert is joining us today. And Gideon, introduce yourself, tell people what you do, and tell us why you love competent gun ownership.
Well, hello everybody, and my name's Gideon Hubert. I am an airline pilot by profession. I am one of the two deputy, or rather vice chairman of Gun Owners of SA. I've also had this firearm rights and ownership related website I've been running since about August 2014, which is called paratus.info, which is also the address of the website. And I'm pro responsible, competent farm ownership because I believe it's an inherent part of our civil rights. In fact, it's one of the most important protectors of our civil rights from infringement. And it also has this wonderful practical application that if you are a trained, competent, and armed farm owner and somebody tries to rob you, you can actually fight back and stop them from killing you, which is kind of a great little bonus feature of it.
Quite. You do have your pet roaming around there. Hopefully
I
that
had
she won't
to.
interfere too much.
No, I had to let him out of the cage. Otherwise, it was going to just cause more noise in the house. So, let's keep fingers crossed.
No, no worries. We like pets here, not birds though. But anyway, that's your
Yeah,
choice.
like
So
proper animals.
yes, unlike birds. So the Capitalist Party has taken as one of its important principles, principle number 9, the responsible ownership of guns for all citizens who are not mentally unstable, who have a
Yep.
violent track record or criminal record. Now, this has caused a bit of consternation, but I think that this live stream will hopefully, explain the policy a bit more fully, and hopefully we can convince a few people to understand that it is a reasonable policy, especially in a country like us, like South Africa. I think the context matters a lot here.
Yeah.
So, what are we proposing? We are proposing that access to guns needs to be by people who are competent to handle a gun and properly licensed to carry a gun as well. So, Gideon, currently speaking, one has to be competent to get a gun licensed and to own one as well. What does competence mean legally in South Africa?
Well, competent means you've completed the required unit standards and modules to receive your SAPS issued competency certificate. So it means you have a certain understanding of the law with regards to owning and using a firearm lawfully. And it also means that you are competent in the technical aspects of handling the firearm responsibly and safely and appropriately, as well as maintaining it. So there are two sides to it. There's a legal side to it, and there's a more practical side of it that embraces safety, responsibility, maintenance, handling, all that sort of stuff. So that's definitely something that I think is reasonable to support because there is a lot of merit in ensuring that people who are licensed to be firearm owners can own and carry those guns.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are, as I keep saying, we are for competent firearm gun ownership. So in essence, in South Africa, for example, I did my gun license. Gideon has his gun license. I had to write a test, an exam, an open book one to take home, and a closed book one after that. And then I had to go to the range and shoot 10 rounds into a target to ensure that I can actually just aim at a target and get 10 rounds in there. If you miss your target, you're not competent. You have to practice a bit more. So we fully support competency. However, the problem arises in South Africa where the licensing of a gun is quite onerous and quite difficult for the majority of people to adhere to. So, Gideon, if you could explain the licensing aspect in terms of the motivation and what is actually required to get a gun, that will be helpful.
The licensing aspect is quite a long discussion by itself because there's so much of it that's a complete stuff up with regards to there are police directives that that are in conflict with the actual Firearms Control Act as to what's needed to license a gun. To boil it down, you need to have a prescribed safe. You need to have a reason for owning this gun, whether it's Section 13, which is a self-defense license, or Section 15, which is occasional sport or hunting use, or Section 16, which is dedicated sport or hunting, or the other sections, which is for security purposes or business purposes rather. So there are all these different sections to the Act, each of which have their own criteria for having a license issued. So at the moment, it's an extremely onerous system to administer. The police don't even comply with the provisions of the law, which is to have the system almost 100% online. And that's a provision that dates from like the 1st of July 2004, when the Farms Control Act of 2000 became law. And to this day, in 2019, which is basically 15 years later, they're still not in compliance with the aspects of the Farms Control Act that are required to actually make it work. And we've got these arbitrary waiting periods that are 90 days and all sorts of things that people are embracing as a safety measure, but they're actually just embracing state inefficiency or bureaucratic inefficiency. There's no reason for criminal record checks and the processing of admin to take as long as it. The system is also hugely costly. It costs, don't chew my microphone, it costs about, at one stage, one component of it was supposed to cost 96 million rand, and the costs inflated. There was a report I read this morning from 2014 that this one specific component of the registry cost over 400 million rand. So it's almost impossible to find how much the Central Farms Registry has cost South African taxpayers since its implementation, but it must be several hundreds of millions, if not billions of rands by now. And we have to ask, surely there's a better way of doing this?
Yeah, so the proposal from the Capitalist Party of South Africa is that you license the person and not the firearm. So that essentially means once a person is competent enough to carry or to own a particular firearm, whether they're competent for a rifle or competent for a handgun or competent for a semi-automatic rifle or a shotgun or any of those firearms, once you're competent to carry those or to own them in this way, the licensing should be a lot simpler. Basically, we recommend perhaps an online system where the dealer where you buy your gun necessarily just logs onto the online database and says, this gun was sold to this person, here's his proof of competence. I think that's essentially the argument that we are making, that makes it a lot easier for people to be able to, own guns for which they are competent in owning. Oh, Gideon, have we lost you?
Sorry. You did, but I'm back. Sorry about that. It's network issues on my side.
It happens. Go ahead. So licensing the person, how is that dramatically different and more efficient in your own words?
Well, basically, licensing the person infers that it's the person, the individual, that holds the license to be allowed to own firearms. So there's only one license. Everything else, the firearms themselves, merely go in a registry. The UK has a similar system with their shotgun certificate system. So what happens is they would vet the individual with the same sort of criteria, no criminal record for violence or debilitating, untreatable mental illnesses, that sort of stuff. And what would then happen is if you comply with all these things and you become a licensed shotgun owner, you would then be issued a shotgun certificate. So each and every single shotgun that you then buy, you merely go to the police and they put the shotgun details, serial number, all that stuff on the registry and on your shotgun certificate, and you carry on. So there is a heck of a lot less administration that needs to be done, as opposed to our current system where we license each and every single firearm. And we've got a backlog at this stage of about 500,000 people that have expired firearm licenses, many of them through no fault of their own. And the police is incapable of processing this amount of paperwork in any reasonable amount of time. So it doesn't really fundamentally change the purpose of the act so much as the way it's being implemented. In fact, this can be done within the existing framework without having to, turn the whole system on its head.
Right.
So it'll be more efficient. It'll definitely free up policing resources so that they can actually do their jobs and have and enforce the law. And I don't see any downside to it. In fact, it's the only way to go.
Yeah, so
really.
basically, as in the comments, which we're going to answer questions in
Yeah.
about 10 minutes. So post them in the comments if you want to. So essentially, we are asking basically for the car licensing program, right? Every time I buy a new car, I don't need to get my K53 license done again. Excuse me. I don't need to write the test again to get a car license. I just use my same car license to buy whatever the hell car I want to at any given time. And that system works really, really well. And all we want to do is implement that for guns, essentially. Sorry, listeners, viewers. It looks like the signal in Cape Town is not as great as the one up here. So yeah, don't move to Cape Town if you want good internet. Gideon, are you there?
Yeah, if you lose me for 5 seconds, you're there. I'll be back.
Right.
So
Or you can just switch off your video and just go audio if you want to.
yeah.
That makes it easier.
Okay. Let's see if it makes any difference. Right.
Right. So yes, essentially, I was just saying that we want what we did with the car license to apply to those two gun licenses, essentially.
Yep, that is a very nice comparison as to how it should work. I mean, you do not take out a license, a driver's license for every car you own. It actually just, the vehicle just goes on a registry.
Yeah, quite. So now let's actually get to the meat of the matter. Why the hell do we even support gun ownership in any single way? A lot of people have emailed us, have called us. They say, we love everything else about you, but your stance on guns puts me off dramatically because ideally you'd want, a gun-free South Africa. No one should have guns. So, Renion, as someone who is a gun owner and who is part of a few shooting clubs and things like that, what do you say to people that say that it's far better that no one has guns than having a licensing regime to own guns for the ordinary citizen?
Well, I'd say to them that is a fantasy world that doesn't exist. There's not a single society on this planet that is gun free. Not even communist China, where there's about 50 million guns in civilian hands, almost twice the number that the government owns. And even if that is a society you want to live in, where the civilian or the citizenry have been completely disarmed, you're not really for a gun-free society. You're for a society where the government and criminals have the sole monopoly on the use of armed force and therefore the use of violence, which is a very totalitarian sort of outlook on life and on society, which I completely don't agree with and can't ever agree with. And it also rejects and fails to take into account the benefits of an armed citizenry. So as a simple example related to South Africa, I try to stay away from American examples because time series data and cross-country comparisons are just fraught with all sorts of difficulties that people seem to ignore to make a point. So in South Africa, from 1994 to 1999, our homicide rate declined by just under 20% over that period. And over the same period, there was 1.2 million new firearm licenses issued, mostly to what we refer to today as previously disadvantaged individuals, but black people who were prevented from exercising their rights as gun owners and privileges of gun owners under apartheid, for the first time could have uninhibited access to licensed firearms. So we have 1.2 million, roughly, new gun owners, many of them poor black people, with a declining homicide rate during a period where our unemployment rate increased, where police sources were cut in 1997, and everything else that went with that. And there is a study by Dr. Richard Wesson that corrects for all these societal events that occurred, including the ending of strife between the ANC and the IFP. And his conclusion is that the increase in civilian firearm ownership or responsible legal civilian firearm ownership in that period contributed to the declining homicide rate. And this is backed up by research by Anthony Altbecker as well. So he is also referenced in that study.
Right. So, so there's, quite a lot of evidence around the world and locally that, generally speaking, if you have generally competent gun ownership in a society, that society is relatively peaceful. So examples, the top 10 countries who have guns, people will be surprised to find out Finland is in there. Serbia is in there. I think Denmark is in there too, and so is France. Then you get some places like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, which is not even a real country at this moment because there's a civil war there. So you have all of these so-called democratic socialist countries, which they aren't, but these Scandinavian countries that are, everyone's utopia, have extremely high gun ownership rates because they are sport shooters and they are hunters mostly. It's rare to find someone who wants a gun for self-defense in Finland, for example. But, a high gun ownership rate does not mean an increase in crime. Often the opposite.
That's entirely true. And Germany is also another example of a country with a relatively high gun ownership rate, especially when you look at recreational activities. And I don't think anyone sees Germany as a particularly violent country. The same goes for Italy, which recently sort of decriminalized ownership of what unknowing and ignorant people refer to as assault rifles, which I don't foresee there being any issues in Italy with that, because countries like the Czech Republic have had quite liberal firearm laws for a very, very long part of their existence. And Prague is wonderful. Switzerland is obviously the one that pops up often because Swiss men are obligated to perform conscription. So they do have fully automatic assault rifles, genuine assault rifles, the military stuff in their homes. And I don't know if that's actually changed at all, but from last I heard, they have that and access to ammunition. And one of the gun-free NGOs in South Africa actually argued and say, yes, but they're locked in a cupboard and the ammunition is sealed in a tin. I'm like, yes, locking the gun in a cupboard and sealing the ammunition in a tin that they can open has prevented mass shootings in Switzerland. Well done. It's prevented violent crime. That is perfect. I think we should all just put the guns in cupboards and seal the ammo in easy openable tins. That's the solution to our problems. So that's the kind of arguments we've been having.
Right. But another important factor, just back to the current licensing regime, is that due to the fact that there are such onerous regulations on owning a gun in the legal sense, and I use legal just through compliance, though, not in terms of any other way. There's a hell of a lot of people who do actually own illegal guns, but who are not criminals. There are some people who live in dangerous areas that would rather have an unlicensed gun on them, to prevent violence being perpetuated against them, rather than not have any gun at all. So these people are technically breaking the law, but they're breaking the law because the law is onerous, not because they want to be criminals.
Correct again. So we have roughly 3 million licensed farm owners in South Africa. And the estimates of illicit farm ownership is that there's up to, I think, 8 million unlicensed firearms in the hands of people out there now. It is impossible that we have 8 million guns in the hands of genuine violent criminals. I think we would know, because that exceeds the total population of Switzerland. And if we had 8 million violent criminals, we would know about it, Roman.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. So just one last aspect before we answer, well, two more aspects before we answer questions on this one. So essentially, our policy about licensing the person is about making non-compliant people compliant with the law, because it'll be, competence is a relatively easier way to become a legal gun owner than to license each and every gun. So first of all, we are making life easier for the millions of people who do own guns, who are not necessarily licensed to carry them, but who carry them because they fear for their lives, because South Africa is a very dangerous country, very high murder rate and rape rate. So obviously we want those people to be competent to carry the guns they already are carrying. We can't expect the police to knock down on 8 million homes around the country and confiscate guns.
No.
And secondly, one of our plans is actually to teach girls in schools to shoot and to become competent at operating a firearm in schools. Once again, this has caused a bit of controversy, but I mean, here's the thinking. A gun is a tool that can give you quite a lot of power, and with that power comes a lot of responsibility. And being competent is understanding the role the gun has in a certain situation, understanding how to control it, how to operate it, how to store it, and to ensure that there's no negligent discharge of the weapon. in areas where it's not supposed to be discharged. So training people at a young age to shoot a gun is actually about empowering the person to buy a gun later on in life, should they wish to do so. But when they do buy that gun, they are competent to own it. And I think that's a very simple concept that we are pushing.
Yeah, it's about empowering through education. Really, it's not remotely as radical a concept as I think people think or see it as. We're not saying here are school children and we're giving them crates of guns. That's one of the more hyperbolic sort of outrage comments I saw on the issue from someone who doesn't seem to understand at all what we're advocating for, didn't even bother watching the video, or was deliberately misconstruing it. It's a matter of we're empowering children with education because, like it or not, especially in poorer areas, kids encounter firearms in violent societies. And if they don't understand what they are encountering, they are at danger of doing something stupid. It's a power tool in a sense. I mean, there's no difference in hazard to user between a bench saw or a drill or a firearm to a person. If you put those in the hands of somebody who doesn't understand it, then they can hurt themselves and other people with it. So it's bizarre to me that there's pushback against empowering through knowledge. Knowledge in itself is not an evil thing. We're not forcing anyone to do anything. We're actually advocating for freedom of choice, and nothing more sinister than that at all.
Yeah, cannot agree more. So let's go to a few questions here. This is something we haven't considered. Any limit on the number of guns per individual? Now, I don't have any statistics to back me up. I'm not too sure. I mean, guns are limited by budget, firstly, and space, secondly, and uses, thirdly. So the limit is actually sort of based on the context. If you're a gun collector, you can have hundreds of them, but they're just lying in cupboards all over your house or in a museum of your choice. If you're a hunter, you probably need 3 rifles. So I think the context matters a lot. I don't think setting an arbitrary limit will actually help anything.
No. Arbitrary limits are silly and unworkable, and there's no logic to them. I mean, we've seen arbitrary limits like at present, unless you have dedicated sports status at the moment or hunting status, you're limited to, I think, owning a maximum of 5 firearms, which would be 1 self-defense firearm. You're only allowed to own 1 handgun for self-defense, for example, which is silly because you might need different types of handguns. Some handguns are smaller than others. It would depend. You're now not given that option at all. So there's an example of an arbitrary limit being completely stupid. There are some sports shooters out there that compete in events that are so varied that they might need 20 or 30 or more guns to remain competitive or just to enjoy what they're doing. It's the same for hunters. So if you're a hunter, a sports shooter, a small collector, and someone who owns guns for self-defense, you could easily own quite a bit. But as you rightly pointed out, they all have to go in a safe, which costs a lot of money. You need space to install all these safes in your house, and they must comply with provisions in the law. And believe it or not, guns are pretty darn expensive in South Africa. They're not cheap things to buy. Even in the second-hand market, you're not finding cheap things for sale. It's a genuine phenomenon. So the imposition of arbitrary limits, I think, is grounded in the nonsensical idea that somehow by curtailing competent law-abiding people from not owning as many guns as they want, we will somehow prevent proliferation of arms through society, even though there's a fair amount of proliferation coming in across the borders, and there's a lot being stolen out of military and police armories across the country on an annual basis. So.
That's very true. So the most important question is why not just go for the no license option at all? So this is my reason why I don't prefer no license, because a license, whether it is a state license or a voluntary association license, is about standards. a gun is a tool, but we would want that person who handles the tool to be able to understand the standards expected of them. So, for example, accountants belong to their own organizations that they are registered to, and that organization sets the rules for accountants. Same with lawyers, same with pilots, same with all sorts of things. So you are actually creating competent gun owners by having standards in place. And for the moment, the state is actually rather good at doing that if the law is fairly narrowly defined and understandable for most people. So no license option to me will actually create a lot more problems than solve. So it's better to have a set of standards at hand, even if it's based on state standards. But it's a lot better than having no standards whatsoever. So I mean, for example, I wouldn't hire a plumber that's sort of not registered with the plumbing association, because the plumbing association makes sure that whoever's a member has certain standards to uphold.
Yeah, I think we're both sort of self-proclaimed anarchists to varying degrees. So South Africa, I don't think, is emotionally ready for a no license system. I don't think we have the required social capital to really make it work yet. And in a sense, people talk about gun culture as if it's a negative thing. In fact, to have that work, and it works really well in the United States, by the way. The most violent places in the United States is where the Second Amendment is most infringed upon. So, but I'm not going to get into that debate.
Oh boy, Cape Town and your signal just bloody well terrible. So another question that I'm just gonna carry on. Gideon will join us just now. Do you think you'll get seats? If you get seats, you'll be able to have influence to fix this horrendous process. Absolutely. We are personally, as far as I'm aware, the only political party that has made competent gun ownership a prime principle of the party. And we are fighting for all 10 principles on our website. So no other party, to my mind, has really tried to influence gun policy in this country. A lot of NGOs have, a lot of people outside of Parliament have, but very few in Parliament. I understand that Freedom Front Plus have tried in the past, haven't been very successful at it, but we are quite, I'm not going to use the word militant, but we are quite set on our principles and we'll fight for each one of them in Parliament every time that we are in there. So, okay, Gideon has disappeared. Maybe he'll come join us back. So I'm just going to answer one or two more questions. Let me see. So if more people start carrying firearms for self-defense, will this not increase the chance of firearm-based attacks with the rise of events such as road rage? Well, that again, you asking a question about a behavior and you sort of inferring that the tool will determine the behavior. That is not true. The behavior determines the action. And if the behavior is one of violence, then people will just use what's at their disposal. So there's a very good case, S versus ED, for example. It's called the hockey stick killer case, where a guy had road rage and he actually killed the driver of the other car with a hockey stick. So things like that happen in a society. You cannot actually prevent people from acting on their emotions or on their angers or things like that. Having a gun does not change the behavior, essentially.
I'm back, by the way.
Right, Gideon. A question that came up was just about, don't we risk increasing the chance of firearm-based attacks with the rise of events such as road rage? For example, if more people are armed, are we not making fighting with firearms more frequent?
No, I don't believe that's the case at all. There's no evidence to support that type of assertion. And in fact, go look at the amount of road rage attacks we have in this country and how many of them involve sort of other weapons, whether it be wheel spanners or pangas or whatever. You can't change, and I think you've already said this, you can't change behavior through regulating objects. The only way you're going to change behaviors of South African drivers is to change their behaviors by encouraging good behavior through other methodologies, or that there is genuine, real consequences for behaving in an undesirable manner. But to regulate objects is silly. I mean, People give us a lot of stick for using the war on drugs as an example of that type of failure of prohibition, but it is a pertinent and it's a very valid example.
Yeah. All right. And now Russell asks, okay, we've got about 2 more questions and then we're going to call it a day or so.
Okay.
How would the ZACB change the self-defense law with regards to shooting criminals who enter your home, for example? So we are true believers in the castle doctrine. So the castle doctrine dictates that you may act forcefully on anyone who is in your private property without your consent. So currently, as far as I understand, Gideon, self-defense requires imminent attack upon yourself or another person before you're allowed to react.
That's
is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. So the castle doctrine really is not about having that requirement of imminent attack. It is about non-consensual, physical presence on the property.
That's it. And it actually doesn't really conflict with our common law principles as a layman, as far as I understand it at the moment in any event. Because what you're doing is you're not rewriting the law, but you are bringing in a doctrine of interpretation of the law that protects innocent people from unnecessary prosecution because they're in essence minding their own business in their own house completely lawfully, and they are about to become victims of predation. And now, because the criminal was on their property, we now have to go through this whole system of trying to figure out, but did the person who shot the guy, did they act within the boundaries of private defense? Whereas, should we even be having these kinds of discussions in a reasonable society where, you were minding your own business and the other person broke several laws already just to, gain access to you where you were sitting in your living room?
Yeah, and under the current law, it's a bit absurd. Someone can be in your house, not facing you, and just take your stuff, and you're not allowed to enforce, you're not allowed to take action or use force upon them. It is really, really absurd. So if you're a robber or a burglar, the ideal situation would actually be to come in without any weapons whatsoever and just randomly walk around and take whatever you want. Because if someone shoots you or attacks you, they are assaulting you or they have murdered you. So the flaw in that argument is, if it's your private property, you should be able to defend it from all threats. And a robber that's armed or unarmed is a threat, and you should be able to act against them.
That's pretty much it, yes.
Right. Let me see if there is anything else that people have been asking. Okay, people are arguing about gun licenses and all that. So yeah, I think that we're going to call it a day. I'm going to try to keep these to 30 minutes or less because we have a lot of work to do in the campaign, to be honest. So thank you very much for joining us today. So I hope you're glad to meet Gideon. He's one of our 10 candidates for Parliament and a rabid defender of competent gun ownership. And we are very happy to have him on board. So Gideon, thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you, Ramon. Thanks for the chat. And hopefully we're probably going to talk about these things more, and hopefully my connection is considerably better next time.
Right. And people can find you at Gideon Jew Bear on Twitter, right? Like Jew, like Jew.
Yes.
Bear.
Yeah.
You need to explain that to me one day.
I will. Actually, we'll explain it over a coffee. It's a long story.
All right, perfect. So,
but I'm clinging to that handle. I've earned it. So
right. I'm actually going to put a chair in the chat so that people can find you and ask questions if required. And if I'm asking them, your website is paratus.info. Paratus.info. And that you can find a lot of Gideon's writings on gun ownership, and the laws. And there you go. We are done. Thank you so much for joining us. We will see you in a few days with someone else on another principle of the Capitalist Party. And remember, if you like us, vote for us. If you don't like us, vote for whoever the hell you want. It's a free society. Cheers.
Excellent. Cheers. Bye-bye.